My name is Pippa Steele, and in this lecture I'm going to introduce you to the theme of linguistic diversity in Roman Britain. My main area of research is classical linguistics, a discipline that focuses on understanding how ancient languages work.
When you picture the Latin language, you might well think of a dry language found in textbooks. That's a dead language, people say. Why study that? But Latin is far from dead. It lives on in the Romance languages spoken today, including Italian, French, Catalan, Spanish, Romanian. Latin has just changed over time, as all languages do. It's better to think of Latin as a spoken language, because that's what it was. We might not be able to listen to Romans speaking, but there is a lot we can do to reconstruct what spoken Latin was like. That's what classical linguistics is all about. What did Latin sound like? Who spoke it? Did different people speak it differently? How did it change over time? What other languages were spoken, and how did different languages interact with each other? I am particularly interested in epigraphy at the moment because I'm running a project called Contexts of and Relations Between Early Writing Systems. This is the CRUISE project. If you try Googling, you can find us online. We're looking at a range of different languages and writing systems from the ancient world, and you might find some interesting content on our website. So what do I mean by epigraphy? Well, Latin is often taught through literary texts from authors like Cicero, Caesar, and Catullus. But the works of these authors only survive because they've been copied over the centuries. We don't have ancient copies of their works surviving. Epigraphy, on the other hand, is the term we use for writing that survives directly from the ancient world, from inscriptions on stone and pottery to papyri and wooden writing tablets. These kinds of documents give us direct access to ancient people who wrote down their language with their own hands. Here are a couple of examples of ancient inscriptions from the Roman world. On the left, you can see one of the Vindolanda tablets, which were found on Hadrian's Wall. This is a thin sheet of wood with an ink text written on it. On the right, you can see another inscription from Hadrian's Wall, but this one is in stone and perhaps looks a bit more typical of what we expect of a Roman inscription. But writing from the Roman world is actually very diverse. Inscriptions are the best sources of evidence we have for linguistic diversity in the Roman world, the topic of this lecture today. Let's start with some historical context. The Romans had very widespread political and military interests, and at the height of the empire, they controlled territories from North Africa and West Asia, all the way to the northernmost province in Britain. The very high levels of mobility around the empire led to changes in the linguistic landscape, but different areas developed in different ways. Consider that modern descendants of the Latin language are still spoken in some areas of Europe today, while other places in the empire's territory did not adopt or maintain spoken Latin in the long term. When studying languages, it is always important to remember that languages are spoken by people. Language can play a significant role in the way people see themselves and how they think about the groups and communities they belong to. Language is one aspect of culture that can be seen as playing a role in ethnicity. Modern scholarship has come to recognize that ethnicity is essentially a construct, that individuals and groups make choices about how they see themselves and others, and what aspects of culture they consider to be part of their own identity. The ancient Greeks, for example, saw shared language as a part of Greekness, to the extent that they had a word for people who didn't speak Greek. They called them barbaroi, barbarians. In the Roman world, where there were many populations speaking many different languages as well as Latin, There was a far less direct relationship between language, ethnicity, and identity. The Romans used Latin in administration and for official purposes, but there is little evidence that they tried to impose the speaking of Latin on conquered populations. In some areas of the empire, people who were native speakers of other languages sometimes saw Latin as a useful language to learn and adopted it in daily use. But this happened to different degrees in different places, and any study of the epigraphic record shows that linguistic diversity was a reality in many areas of the Roman world. The rest of this lecture will focus on Roman Britain specifically. When the Romans arrived in Britain, they would have encountered local languages belonging to the Celtic language family, so closely related to modern Welsh, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Cornish Breton, and so on. That Celtic language of Iron Age Britain never had its own tradition of writing, but we do sometimes find traces of it in Latin inscriptions. That brings us to the first of 4 inscriptions from Roman Britain that I want to show you. This is what we call a curse tablet, and has been scratched on a thin sheet of lead with a pointed stylus. This one comes from Bath, which was called Aquae Sulis by the Romans. If you look closely, you can see that each word has been written backwards. The first line reads, Qui mihi wilbiam involavit, though a couple of letters are missing at the beginning and end. This is a curse directed against the person who stole my Wilbia. Now, for a long time, it was thought that Wilbia was a woman's name, and this was someone complaining about their girlfriend being pinched by someone else. But actually, we now think that Wilbia is a Celtic word, perhaps meaning knife. So here we have some direct evidence of the Celtic language used in Roman Britain. So this inscription tells us something about languages being spoken in Roman Britain and about the interaction between Latin, seen here in a writing tradition associated with religious practice, and a local Celtic language that was clearly spoken, even though it is less visible in the epigraphic record. It is very rare to find more than a word or two written in that Celtic language, although we do have evidence of a lot of names of Celtic etymology, for instance. Our next example brings together multiple linguistic and cultural influences. This gravestone was found in South Shields at the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall. It commemorates a woman named as Regina, the ex-slave and wife of a man called Barates from Palmyra. Regina is labelled as a member of the Catavalorni, a southern British tribe, who is presumably a native speaker of a local Celtic language, although there's no trace of this on the gravestone. Her name is Latin. Regina is the Latin word for queen. Presumably she took on this name as a substitute for whatever her original name may have been. I already mentioned that Regina's husband, Barates, was from Palmyra, which is a city in modern Syria. At the bottom of the gravestone, beneath the Latin text, a line of text in a different language and writing system appears. This is Barates' native Palmyrene, a Semitic language. So this gravestone gives a particularly cosmopolitan outlook on mobility and language use in the Roman Empire. Barates is presumably in Britain because of some attachment to the Roman army. He marries a British woman, and when she dies, he leaves his monument to her in Latin and Palmyrene. There may even be other linguistic elements at play. The first line of the Latin text gives us something of a puzzle. It reads, Regina liberta et conjuge. Regina, the freedwoman and wife. Now, in Latin, conjuge can only be the ablative case. Okay, now that ought to mean something like by or from Regina, the freedwoman and wife. but this is a gravestone, so it should really be in the dative case. That is, it should be to or for Regina, the freedwoman and wife. However, it's been suggested that these three words might actually be in a completely different case, the accusative. Now, in Latin, the accusative expresses the object of a sentence, that is, the thing having something done to it. In Latin, the accusative case should end in an M, but these words are clearly missing a final M, which might be explained by the fact that final M became quite a weak sound in spoken Latin as Latin went on. So perhaps we should be reading Reginam libertam et conjugem here. Now, if these are accusatives, this could actually be influenced from the Greek formula used on gravestones, which more typically might have an accusative here. In fact, Barates could have been familiar with Greek, since it was a widely spoken language in the Eastern Empire. So as you can see, this is a very interesting inscription, and one that gives us quite rich evidence of possible linguistic interplay. Our next object also involves the eastern and southern fringes of the Roman Empire. This is a stone inscription from York, set up probably in the reign of Septimius Severus. It records the dedication of a temple to an Egyptian god, Serapis, a god who was also popular among some Romans at the time. This is the northernmost evidence we have for the practice of Egyptian religion. There is, in fact, some other evidence for the practice of mummification of bodies in Roman York, which could also point in the direction of Egyptian religious practice. The temple was dedicated by a man called Hieronymianus, a Greek name. Greek was a prevalent language in Roman Egypt, so it's possible that he was himself an Egyptian. It's likely that the dedication of the temple was intended to please the Emperor Septimius Severus, who was actually from North Africa. While evidence for language use is somewhat indirect here, we do have clear indications of people coming from diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds, whose presence impacted on the linguistic and on the cultural landscape of Roman Britain. Our final object is a small, unassuming piece of pottery found at Holt on the Welsh border, just south of Chester. It bears an inscription, but not in Latin. This is the Punic writing system, used in North Africa and some other areas of the Mediterranean to write a Semitic language that we call Punic. This inscription is actually the northernmost example of written Punic. The inscription consists of one word, a man's name, Macrinus. Although this is notionally a Roman name, we know that it was a popular name in North Africa, and it was quite probably a substitute for, or a sort of Romanized version of, a Punic name, something like Makar. The Punic alphabet is a development from an earlier alphabet, Phoenician, which is also related to others, including Palmyrene, which we saw earlier. The Punic alphabet does not have separate signs for vowels, so it mainly encodes consonants in writing. However, we can see in this inscription that some of the letters double up as vowel signs. We call these matres lectionis, or mothers of reading. So a particular letter could be, in some instances, read as a normal consonant, but could be read as a vowel. Now, Macrinus is spelt as follows. M, that's the sign on the right, because this reads from right to left. Next, a letter known as ayin, which is usually a consonant sound, something like but here stands for a vowel sound, a. Then there's a Q and then an R. Then a letter called yod, which usually represents the sound y, but here stands for the vowel sound, e. Then there's an N. The final letter is called Aleph, and this usually represents a consonant, but here represents a vowel, something like You can see how those sounds are quite close together, and it would be sort of natural to use the consonant letter to represent the vowel sound. Now, why does this end in an sound and not in us, as in Macrinus? Well, it was actually common for names ending in us, when transcribed in Punic, to be written without the final S. So this would be pronounced something like Macrine. That seems quite similar to the vocative case in Latin, which is the form of a name that you use when you're speaking directly to a person. So not Macrinus, but Macrine. You can see here that transcribing a name in the Punic alphabet was not just a simple thing, it required thought and attention to each sound. In this lecture, we have seen 4 inscriptions that can help us to think about language use in Roman Britain. There was a curse tablet in Latin that included a Celtic word, and so evidence of spoken Celtic language. A gravestone of a British woman, presumably a Celtic speaker, but with inscriptions in Palmyrene, her husband's language, and in Latin, but with possible influence from Greek, so a complicated multilingual inscription. We saw a temple dedication to an Egyptian god by a Greek-named man who might himself have been an Egyptian. And we saw a Punic inscription on a piece of pottery by a man who presumably was himself a Punic speaker from North Africa. Now, each inscription is a snapshot of linguistic and cultural diversity. You could perhaps think of them as pieces in a jigsaw, as long as you remember that we don't have all the pieces of this jigsaw, and it isn't always obvious what was in the gaps. But we do know that these glimpses of diversity are symptomatic of very high levels of mobility across the Roman world. In large part, that was a result of Roman colonial and military activities. However, it also relied on people making decisions, whether conscious or otherwise, about how they saw and represented themselves. This brings us to the end of the lecture, which I hope you've enjoyed. I wanted to finish with a couple of ideas for following up on this topic using some worksheets. There are 2 worksheets for you to have a go at. The first one asks you to try writing something down in cursive Latin. It doesn't have to be Latin. You could write your name, you could write a short English message. It's almost like writing in code because cursive Latin looks quite different from the language you're used to seeing in monumental Latin inscriptions. Cursive Latin is the term we use for Latin that was written by hand, usually in something like ink, and it had more sort of curved, flowing forms. So, for instance, this is the variety of the Latin alphabet that you would usually see in texts like the Vindolanda tablets. I showed you one of those at the beginning of the lecture. When you try writing in it, think about what it's like to write in this system, and whether there are some confusable letters, for instance, as well. Do you find it easy to read back what you've just written down? The second worksheet asks you to think about interaction between different languages by asking you to try writing down your name in the Punic alphabet. We've already seen that writing down a name in the Punic alphabet is not necessarily easy. It raises the question of how well a writing system used for one language can represent the sounds of a completely different language. So Punic encodes some sounds that are not present in other languages, and equally there are some sounds that are present in other languages that don't have a letter that's appropriate for them in Punic. So if you have difficulty representing the sounds in your name when you try to write it in the Punic alphabet, what you have to remember is that this is exactly what people in the ancient world were encountering all the time. Linguistic diversity was a pervasive feature of Roman Britain and of the wider Roman Empire. This is a topic of interest in linguistics, as I hope you've seen in this lecture, but it also relates to wider issues of how people in the Roman Empire thought about themselves and others, issues which you can also follow up by looking at other areas of cultural practice.